Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar, which is part of our collaborative approach webinar series. We're focusing on ward and board rounds in this module, and today we're going to be discussing patient involvement and patient engagement. I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Eddie Kinsella, who's chair of the Patient and Care Network, to join us today and discuss this important topic. Eddie is a previous chief executive with the NHS and now works as chair of the Patient and Care Network, which is hosted by the Royal College of Physicians. Over the last few years, we've worked quite closely with Eddie and the team, and it's been a huge privilege for me personally to be involved with the Patient and Care Network, and I hope we'll continue that collaboration moving forward. We've also seen tremendous benefit when it comes to involving patients with motivating frontline staff and using the patient perspective to drive improvements. That's hopefully what we're going to be focusing on today. So should we run the slides if that's okay, Crystal? So just quickly to go over the learning objectives for this module of the collaborative approach. You can read those in front of you now, but just to highlight the importance of the second learning objective here, which we hope will be fully met by today's presentation. Next slide, please. And we can just double click that if that's okay, Crystal. So we've got, as you're familiar with by now, 4 modules, and today's the third learning event for the ward and board round. And last 2 weeks we've had fantastic webinars looking at the workforce solutions with Rob Penate, the focused site management model with Helen Krasinski and Andy Aldridge, and then my colleague Amit Arora and colleagues from the Midlands and East team presenting on deconditioning on Tuesday. All of these events are available on playback to watch on demand and can be shared with your teams. I have to say I'm slightly biased, obviously, but the standard of the presentations recently have been really exceptional, really high quality presentations and discussions. So please do tap into them and use them as a resource. Next slide, please. Crystal. And just to summarize, as part of the collaborative approach, this is now our 12th event. We've had over 1,000, close to 1,200 people watch either live or on demand, and we're very grateful for the feedback. There will be a feedback form, an MS Forms put into the chat box at the end. We really appreciate and value any feedback, good or bad, so that we can continue to work on improving these events for you and make them practically useful and helpful and pragmatic for you. So any feedback is really very much appreciated. Please do fill in the forms at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please, Crystal. So I'm going to hand over to Eddie. The format this afternoon is Eddie's going to present. There'll be an opportunity to ask Eddie some questions at the end of his presentation, and then I'm going to go through a few examples that either I'm aware of or have been involved with, and hopefully use those to and as well as Eddie's presentation to energize and motivate some debate and discussion amongst all of us. So Eddie, thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew, and thank you everybody for inviting me. I haven't got a great number of slides. I just want to talk briefly, really, to share my perspective. Perhaps just reiterating what Andrew said at the outset, an unusual background in that I actually spent most of my career as an NHS chief executive. And the reason I wanted to become involved with the Patient and Care Network with the Royal College of Physicians was that, despite the fact that I had many decades of NHS experience, and my late wife was a former ward sister, she developed a very rare autoimmune disease. And between us, we spent 8 years going through the system. And it gives you a very different perspective when you're going through the system. It was 8 years before my wife died. My mother also had Alzheimer's for 7 years. And my mother-in-law had vascular dementia for 5 years. So although I don't regard myself in any way as an expert patient, I actually think I have both sides of the fence, as it were, to offer. And one of the key themes, really, I want to get across today and throughout is about the importance of a partnership approach and challenging assumptions, because nobody comes to work in the NHS to do a bad job for their patients. Every single one of you wants to do the very best for your patients, but often we make assumptions. I include myself in that, and those assumptions can sometimes be wide of the mark, because there are very different perspectives and each patient is different. And it's about what matters to the patient as well as what is the matter with you. It's treating the whole person, as it were. And an important part of that is to walk in my shoes. And that obviously requires insight and it requires empathy. So those are the key things really I'd like to discuss. I often use a quotation from Angela Coulter, which dates back to 2011, which says that there's a mismatch between what clinicians believe they do and what patients actually experience. Now, that was in 2011, and obviously if we move to where we are at the moment, as you all know only too well, the current context is that we've had the impact of the pandemic, which has been enormous and hasn't gone away, still with us, still having a dramatic impact. Additionally, there's a huge increase in the number of patients who are 85 or more years of age, each of them bringing multiple comorbidities. So obviously far more complex to deal with those patients. As you know better than I, there are inadequate staffing levels. It would appear that the Parliament has only recently woken up to this fact, even though it's a decade old or more. And obviously that then has a dramatic impact in terms of staff burnout. Additional to that, of course, we have a broken social care system, sadly. So every single hospital in this country, again, you know better than I, has many of its beds filled with patients who could be more appropriately looked after either at home or in the community, but can't be discharged. And then obviously all of that combines to give the danger of the care becoming too task focused. And if it's task focused, that's when it becomes a negative experience for patients. Now, there was a recent Patient Association report, a survey done of many patients of current difficulties. And the three top words that came out of that report was frightened, frustrated, and vulnerable, which obviously is not what any of us wants for our patients. That comes back to the theme really of working closely in partnership, because whenever any of us enter the system, whether you're a doctor, a nurse, a former chief executive, whatever it is, you still want the same thing. You want reassurance that someone is going to look after you. Now, some of the things that came out of our work on the ward rounds and board rounds, that some of the causes of concern for patients, that they felt they're being done to and treated as a case, not as a person. There was uncertainty about who's actually in charge, of my care, and what's their particular role in my care. Sometimes obvious things around lack of privacy, particular issue around communication and not being listened to, sadly, and then not actually being certain about what's been said and what's happening to me next. And then obviously the issue around, well, there are other people, my relatives, my family, my friends, they're important and they don't seem to be involved as well. So there are a whole range of problems, but we can actually, and this whole collaborative demonstrates that we can make great progress. We can make improvements if we actually work together. Crystal, could you just put my brief slides on now, if you could? Next one, please. So that's really the starting point for me. It's about creating a shared purpose. That bit about what matters to you, the whole person, not simply treating the illness, not simply what is the matter with you, the whole thing around what matters to you, because there are very different perspectives. I'll give you a simple example. My late mother-in-law, say, who had vascular dementia, until she actually became requiring a lot more support, and we moved her nearer to me and my family. All of her surrounding family and her friends, most of them had died. And what mattered most to her was her little dog, her loyal little dog who gave her unconditional love. So if she needed to go into hospital, What mattered to her was, who's going to look after my dog? Now, that might sound very simple, but actually it was very, very important to her. And each patient obviously is different. We all bring our own personal baggage with us when we enter the system. So it's understanding that and creating a shared purpose. Next slide, please, Crystal. Obviously, again, this collaborative has demonstrated this terrific progress can be made. What's important is that conducive climate, being realistic. As I said earlier, obviously, none of you are actually working in nice, calm conditions. To be candid, sometimes it must feel like a war zone. So you have to be realistic about the outset, about what is it that we can actually think that we can do, and how does that fit in with other priorities. And then once you've decided that, it's about, well, committing the resources to it. Now, the intellectual resources is important, but actually more important, I believe, is the hearts and minds bit, actually getting people on board that this is something that they want to do because they genuinely believe it can make a difference for the better. And it can make a difference for the better if you actually engage with patients and their families from the very outset. But that's not a one-way street. You actually need to make explicit there are expectations and responsibilities on both sides. It isn't all about, well, the ward staff will have to do this, etc. It's about setting out some sensible parameters about what we think we can achieve and who's going to do what and when are we going to report back on that. And part of that, again, comes back to what I was saying earlier. This needs to be bespoke as far as possible. As I said, we all bring our different baggage with us. And in particular, we need to take into account those patients who are most vulnerable, who are most disadvantaged. So try and get the best mix of patients you possibly can, if that's possible. Next slide, please, Crystal. And again, it's building upon your existing strengths and best practice. This collaborative demonstrates that some terrific ideas are actually being implemented already. Use those, adapt those, find out what's going on elsewhere, and tailor it to your particular context, your particular circumstance. Again, part of that is about tackling health literacy. Not every patient obviously understands or has access to all of the information that they need. Not every patient understands all the various jargon and medical terms that we use, the acronyms, etc. And in particular, those who are most vulnerable, those who are disadvantaged, you need to think about how best to ensure that they're part of this, that they can actually have ownership themselves as well. That includes actually providing some support networks for those patients, as well as for the staff. Make sure that people don't feel that they're on their own, that they feel isolated, that they actually feel they're part of a team and that they can contribute to that team and that their contribution is actually valued. And a very, very simple thing, but actually I believe very, very important, celebrate success, because you're all under enormous pressure. It's often very easy to slip into a trough of despair at all of those difficult things that you have to tackle. But if you can actually celebrate success, it genuinely will provide momentum and enable you to take things forward. The next slide, please, Crystal. And really, the evidence base, this isn't just a nice thing to do. All the evidence demonstrates very clearly it actually makes services safer and more effective, and it actually gives them that the patient-centered experience that we're all looking to achieve. Now, really finishing off from my perspective, often patients and their families, when they go through the system, because the system can be very complex, because they may not just have their care in one particular point or with one particular clinician or team, navigating that system can be quite complex for them. But equally, they create a reservoir of knowledge around their particular condition. And the patient and their families can actually be a navigator for the clinicians, for the team, for you. They can actually act as a knowledge broker. They can actually help you to give you that insight about that particular patient and enable both the patients and the system itself to create resilience. So just reiterating, for me, it's all about a partnership approach. From the very outset, it's about making sure that we challenge some of the assumptions that we all carry with us, and making sure that we actually look at the whole person, not just their illness. I think that's me finished, I think, Crystal. Other than, obviously, we'd be very happy to give you any more information that you might like about the Patient and Care Network. including if any of you or members of your family would be interested in joining. We are a group of about 45 patients and carers, and we have a wide spread of skills and backgrounds and experiences, but like a lot of groups, we're not sufficiently diverse. We don't have enough people from disadvantaged and ethnic backgrounds, and we welcome those individuals becoming involved. I'm happy to give them more information about that. Happy to get involved in the discussion now. Thank you.
Eddie, thank you very much. And it's always a pleasure to hear you speak and to hear your reflections. I just wonder if we could start with a piece of audience engagement, if that's okay. Just if people wouldn't mind just putting up an electronic hand if you feel that you've got a good rapport or relationship with patients in your organisation. So just a quick show of hands if you feel that you've got a good sort of patient forum at work. Of course, I've done that very confidently, and I can't see any hands up, but I don't. I'm not confident whether that means that there aren't any hands up. I'm assuming that suggests that people don't feel confident that they've got good patient representation and good engagement. So, Eddie, perhaps you've emphasised the role of partnership working. Before we go into some little examples and little vignettes that we can share with the audience, is that from your maybe even from your experience as a chief exec, what can people do on the call to go out and reach out to patients and engage with them?
Well, there are lots of different groups available. I mean, obviously I'm happy to beat the drum for the Patient Care Network of the Royal College of Physicians, but also there's a terrific amount of information available at the Patients Association, National Voices, etc. And obviously each of you should also have in your organisations, the PALS groups and groups like that. But it's wider than that. Particularly the point I was making about our own weaknesses of those disadvantaged groups. There's a lot of merit in actually going out of the organisation, as it were, to the hard to reach groups. So, for example, within our Patient Care Network, we have a medical director of patient involvement who's a consultant in palliative care, and she's been involved, for example, in dealing with Southeast Asian communities who are sometimes hard to reach. And because they're hard to reach, we shouldn't assume that they have to come into the system to be able to, be given support and help, because obviously the whole idea is to provide support and help. So think outside the box, as it were, I think is the first thing. And then secondly, use some of the best practice that already exists. And the bit I mentioned about gathering momentum on enthusiasm, I think that's a fundamental point, because where there's a particular project that has lit the fuse, as it were, share that widely, because it then stimulates other people to have other ideas. So now, within the Royal College of Physicians, they have an annual Excellence in Patient Care Awards. And there's some terrific examples have come out of that. And people can dip, you can go onto the website of the Royal College of Physicians and dip into that, for example. And there are some excellent examples there of true co-production. And what I mean by that, obviously, from the very outset, the patients and their families have been involved, not sort of as an add-on as we go along. Now, realistically, given the pressures, we can't always have true co-production, but that's the holy grail that we should aim for. And as I say, there are exemplars that can be used and tapped into, and do that. I would advocate, and then amend it. Tailor it to your particular organisation, your particular circumstance. It's not easy, to be candid, to get to the hard to reach groups. One of the things we're doing or about to do as a patient and care network in the Royal College is to revisit our terms of reference, because when we set them up, because we're an integral part of the Royal College, obviously the governance process has to be spot on. The Royal College is a charity, and it's obviously it has to work within the Charity Commissioner's legal obligations. But with hindsight, we're now reflecting that perhaps with the best will in the world, the person specification and all the other sort of interview arrangements that we set up, maybe they're too much of a barrier. Maybe we need to be more flexible around things like that so that people can dip in and out. Not everybody has the same amount of time, including things like, when do you hold meetings? If they're held in the daytime, obviously that will exclude a whole chunk of people. Some people obviously don't have the time that others have. So there are a range of things that you can think about in terms of common sense and practical ways of engaging. The more perspectives that you can get, the better, because obviously again, I include myself in this, there's a degree of unconscious bias that we demonstrate, sadly. There's a famous quotation: we see things not as they are, but as we are. And the more diverse the range of views you can get in terms of patients, the far better it's going to be, the far more productive. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer, Andrew.
It's really helpful and also highlights some of the challenges, and that there isn't really both a one size fits all or a quick fix here, but there are opportunities, and probably wider opportunities than we may be aware of. So as an example, a couple of things. So I can see Harry's on the call from Barts Health. I used to work at Barts Health as a consultant over there, and the Imam and head of chaplaincy at Newham and overall for Barts Health has a very strong reach into a very difficult to reach community, and so going through the chaplaincy service and faith leaders opens up doors, in ways that, as a ward-based, hospital-based doctor I would say weren't open. And we did a lot of work around that with end-of-life care and cancer care and things, but just thinking a bit differently around it. From a ward-based perspective, I think that most of us will have, I use the term not in a pejorative sense, but in a way of identifying frequent flyers, patients who are frequently in hospital. Please forgive me, that is not meant in a pejorative way, but these are patients who have regular touch points with our inpatient service, and they can provide valuable insights. And it's worth just in the past, I've literally just taken them for a cup of tea on their way to a discharge now and sat them down and listened to, and you learn interesting things about the ward. The fact that the night staff don't turn off the TV, and that stops people sleeping at night. It's a little things that make a big difference. Megan's put a useful book into the chat around unraveling unconscious bias. There's lots of things around that, so thank you, Megan. And I'd just say for everyone else, what we will do at the end of this is we'll put together some resources. So Eddie talked about the Excellence in Patient Care Awards, and I think Amit, one of my colleagues, is actually a recipient of one of those awards, and we were very fortunate with the Modern Ward Round work that's been recently recognised by the IHI in Gothenburg this year. So we'll put some of those references together to share with people. What I'd like to do, if it's okay, Eddie, I'm going to give a couple of examples and see if we can use those to spark some debate, and then I also open it up. If anyone's got any questions, either raise a hand or put them in the chat box now. I wasn't very successful when I asked people to raise hands electronically last time. I'll take stunned silence as a positive response, which I think you can do nowadays. So, Crystal, if we go back to the slides, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with people some sort of pragmatic examples that I've been involved with, either directly or indirectly, and hopefully one of the things that we've been trying to do with our collaborative approach is give people who are joining the calls and people who are watching on demand some top tips and practical advice that they can just go out and actually start to do today on the wards or in your clinical area. Most of what we're going to do and talk about is based on the model of improvement, so I don't make any apologies for putting this slide back in. It's actually it underpins all the work that we do. The reason it underpins it is because it's tried and tested, it's highly reproducible and highly reliable, and it's really straightforward and easy for staff to understand. We'll put a link in and share these slides, but this is fundamental to everything that we do. So next slide, please, Crystal. So I'm going to start with just a signpost, simply to Tuesday's presentation, where the team from the east of England presented the work that they'd done on the winter deconditioning games, or stopping deconditioning. You can see stuff there. I was just bowled over, and bearing in mind I knew some of the stuff that had gone on, I only had skimmed the surface, and what I loved about it was the simplicity of it, and it was all patient focused. It was very, very straightforward. They were not talking about big financial bids, they weren't talking about big bits of equipment. It was really simple and straightforward work and improvement work that engaged and involved patients, and as a result led to improved staff satisfaction, better outcomes for patients. So if you haven't seen it, please do look at Tuesday's video, and there's loads of ideas and top tips from wards and ward areas, and you can see it's inspired by the MPJ paralysis and the work of Brian Dolan and the team. So all of that is there. So next slide, please. This is a project that I did many years ago. In fact, before I was a consultant, and this is based on, again, an IHI methodology, which is ask one question. And I put this up because it's actually really, really easy to do, and really helped reframe what was happening on the wards. So we took a group of fourth year medical students who were on placement in the organisation. It was at Newham at the time. And all we did was ask them to ask one question of every patient at every interaction. So whenever they met a patient, whether that be taking a history, taking blood, seeing them in clinic, on the wards, wherever it was, at the end of their interaction with the patient, they were to ask the patient one question: what one thing could they do to improve their care in hospital today? And this, you can see by the Wordle what the results were, and you know, as someone who leads on nutrition and hydration, obviously this is highly pertinent. So most people just wanted a simple thing. They wanted a glass of water, wanted the lights turned off, they wanted to go home. Obviously they wanted access to healthcare professionals. But actually, when I played this out to my colleagues, the healthcare professionals, actually, and asked them what they thought patients wanted, it was all the medicalisation stuff. And that kind of links into what Eddie was saying earlier, which is the simple things. What we think people want is often not what people want themselves and patients want themselves. So we've put that in there. You can go and do this afternoon. Just ask one question of one patient in one bay of a ward. What one thing what could we do to improve your care in hospital today? And just see whether that marries with your expectations and the expectations of your ward-based staff. It's really simple, really powerful stuff. Next slide, please. We've talked about this before. Again, this is something that I've done on my own wards, and I rather arrogantly think I'm a relatively good communicator, and you know, in a 28 bedded ward, barely one patient could answer all these 4 questions after a ward round, and it just goes to show the lengths that we need and the time and the effort we need to put into communicating more clearly with our patients. And it's not us telling them, it's about communication and a dialogue. And I'll come on to some examples of where you can look for best practice and doing things differently. But the idea is that to improve flow and to get patients out discharged from hospital in a more timely manner for us, for them, they really need to be able to answer these 4 questions at every point in their inpatient journey. What's wrong with me? What's going to happen to me today? What needs to happen for me to go home? And when am I going home? And as I say, barely one patient out of 28 of my patients could answer that question. And it was really eye-opening, because I like to think I was a good communicator. And so again, this is something you just go take this to the ward this afternoon, do this for one patient, one bay, and see what it shows. And ask your clinical teams, ask the MDT on the ward, how many of your patients do you think can answer these questions? Then go and ask them. And it's a really good way of opening up a conversation and a dialogue between patients and clinicians. And Erica, a very good point. What matters to me, and I've made that point, I've made a little point about that myself, and I commented on earlier. What matters to me is really important to staff as well. We know we haven't talked about this, Eddie. I don't know whether I'll pause and bring you in about compassionate healthcare, which starts with compassion to staff, and if we're not compassionate to staff, staff won't be compassionate to our patients. Eddie, your thoughts on that?
I absolutely fundamentally couldn't agree more. I mean, I deliberately use the term partnership. And I also deliberately sort of made the point about a two-way street in terms of expectations. There is no merit at all in staff actually being treated as if they don't count. And I'm very conscious, again, as deliberately put at the outset, the current context, the pressures everybody is working under is enormous. And there's a lot of evidence, obviously, that unless you actually treat staff well, then that has a detrimental impact upon them and upon patients and their families. I use a little, perhaps I should have used it today. I use a slide. There's in the utility room of my house, there's a small notice board with lots of things on it. And one of the notices is written in crayons by my daughter when she was about 7 or 8 years old. And what it says is, treat others as you would like them to treat you. Now, my daughter's 39 years old now, and she has an 8-year-old daughter of her own. And so obviously over those, 30 years or so, the colours on the crayons have faded somewhat, but the message is timeless. And I think, it's really, really important to be compassionate with staff in order for them to be able to do their very best for patients and their families. And I know, obviously with my former background, as it were, I know that people can be somewhat skeptical, if not cynical, about this, that, that lots of nice words are spoken, but it doesn't always turn out in practice. But there has to be a crystal clear focus on making sure staff feel that they're valued and that their own circumstances are taken into account in order for them to do their very best. As a personal note, I am desperately hoping that the pressure that the Health and Social Care Select Committee and Parliament are now putting upon government will actually translate into more investment into the proper staffing levels at every level right across the NHS. It's so important.
Thanks, Eddie. And I mean, from a personal perspective, I also am mindful and conscious. I don't think the NHS as an employer is a kind and compassionate employer.
No.
I just open it up, pause to reflect. I don't want to be too downbeat about things, but is anyone on the call who'd like to share their thoughts on that? Because we have a number of senior leaders and things on the call. So excuse me for a second, I'm in an open office. Is there anyone on the call who want to share either the highlights or lowlights of how they're looking after themselves, their patients, those kind of things? Please just either put it in the chat or put your hand up. It'd be great to hear from people.
There's a hand up there from Thomas White.
Oh, lovely. Thank you very much. Tom, do you want to come on camera? Welcome, Thomas.
Hi, thank you. I actually work for the Hampshire, Southampton and Isle of Wight CCG, covering the Isle of Wight urgent care commissioning. But kind of what Personally, I've had some sort of fantastic sort of care and support through a few issues personally that I've had from a CCG point of view, but I am aware that with the kind of ED and ED side of things, I think it's probably different. So I think there probably are managers that probably would like to have the sort of more time to be compassionate and caring, but with the reality of if it's a congested ED and certain pressures are sort of more life and death, then maybe there isn't so much of the opportunities, and I guess there's more risks of like one-to-ones being cancelled and supervisions when it's like at April 4. But I don't sort of really have a magic answer to that. And personally, because I've particularly seen that the NHS pay debates gone up again, this is just a personal point of view, but I would be happy for maybe clinical staff to have have like a clinical band 3, which might be sort of a little bit more than a non-clinical band 3, just because of the sort of physical and kind of emotional pressures that they might be facing.
Thank you, Tom. So that's really kind of you to share your experience. I think we'd all agree, and I think it highlights, doesn't it, that there are competing pressures, and you then are led into a situation where you have to compromise. I'm very aware that as a medic, as a doctor, when we have trainees, for example, we are in a very protected and privileged position. If we don't look after our trainees explicitly with structured interviews and one-to-ones, all those kind of things, actually those trainees get taken away from us. So I'm very mindful that particularly with that sort of structure doesn't happen in operational field and those kind of things. So I still feel very protected and privileged in that arena, but very mindful that others are not. I think, Eddie, just coming back onto your point about the golden rule, I was very lucky, which one of my very early clinical mentors would basically drum that or bang that drum on every ward round. If the care that I was providing, her team was providing, was not good enough for one of our family members, it wasn't good enough for one of her patients. And I think in the noise and pressures and everything else, I think some of that stuff does get lost. But also sometimes that's not a criticism of the staff, that's a reflection of the system. And Tom, your point exactly about ED and crowding and pressures just highlights that. So people would not want that for their loved ones, but the system doesn't help them with that.
Can I just come back in on that, Andrew, as well? I mean, one of the key, if I wear my former hat as a former chief executive, and I managed a number of hospitals as well as a large health authority, one of the key things is this bit about assumptions. Is that the people at the very top, the chief executive, the board, etc., the medical director, all those, they need to actually see for themselves. There needs to. I used to try and spend as much time as I could on walkabout at every part, as it were. But even so, there were still assumptions, and unless people see for themselves the type of pressures, then those assumptions will go unchallenged. And there ought to be certain red lines that are never crossed in terms of, staff obviously ought to have the ability to have some kind of break. They ought to have the ability to be hydrated, all the obvious stuff. And unless people, the senior people take the time to go and see and to listen and to experience, to gain the insight, unless they do that, they won't have ownership of the problem. They'll make an assumption that things are going on okay because nobody's told me otherwise. And so I know this sounds simplistic, but it's important for people to be encouraged, senior people to be encouraged to come and see. Go into the emergency departments, not just once or twice as it were, but go in frequently at different times, including at night. I one of the things I did in my career, I served on an independent inquiry into a very serious case in Yorkshire where a senior nurse had been accused of killing patients. Obviously a very unusual case, but one of the things about that was it was actually a very well run hospital. I won't name it, although it took national headlines at the time, but it was a very well run hospital, apart from the fact that the senior people didn't go around at night. And you made the point about televisions being on, etc. The senior people need to go around at night, and they need to go around at other times, and to get a better feel, if they're not already doing so, about the pressures that staff are under. If they do that, then you can reach some kind of uneasy compromise, because I can't pretend that the pressures everybody's under is going to suddenly magically go away. It's not, obviously, but there need to be certain red lines that are never crossed in terms of making sure the staff are treated well, are treated safely.
Thanks, Eddie. I mean, I think the importance of visible leadership is held in high value by us and those on the call, I'm sure, but equally many of us will think that that's absent, and I think particularly now people will not go to the emergency department because they're rather scared of what they may find. There is a bit of reflection for me on that, about the fact that actually there is, as Thomas said, there is no simple solution here, but actually just being visible and present goes an awful long way. I just, for someone who's on call and comes in at night, I often see the highs and the lows of the hospital in the middle of the night, and it's invaluable for me personally, but also just to be mindful that the CQC will drop in the middle of the night. So it's a tried and tested method of checking out of checking out what's going on in your organization. So a really important point. I'm going to come back onto the slides if I may, Crystal. I'm also conscious that my colleague and close friend Amit is on the call, and Amit, I think I'm right in thinking I'll go back a couple to the deconditioning games if I may, or if we may, Crystal. Amit, it'd be lovely to hear your thoughts of the best bits of the winter deconditioning games, because you had a key part to play. I don't know if you're available to join in person. I think Amit's on site today, so it may be that he's with us but not able to join with internet connections. I'll just give it a couple of seconds just to see if he can. No, so obviously technical issues. So apologies there, but Amit was heavily involved. I'm sure Amit won't mind being contacted directly, or any of us will be, so we can put out my contact details and do get in touch. So Crystal, if we go back through to the slides, so I've got a couple of last slides to just give people some top tips. This was some work that was done at King's during the pandemic by some junior doctors, looking at communication aids and visual communication. King's is in a socially deprived inner city area in London, South London, and has a huge mix of nationalities, races, and educational attainment in its population that it is proud to serve. And I just wanted to highlight this because other organisations have done similar work, but again, it was really the way they engage the multi-professional team in doing this, a simplistic way of doing it, and the way they use the model for improvement is really, really a great case study. They published it in BMJ Open Quality. We put the link in there. Just go and read the paper, and they talk you through step by step what they did and the communication tools. I know it doesn't project very well on the slides, but it's there in the document for you to use. And it was just a wonderful piece of work that I really liked, and I thought I would share with you. And the final slide is is work that we did with Eddie and the team. So if we do the next slide, here we are, thank you very much, about the modern ward round. So I started my relationship with the Patient Carer Network with Lynn Quinney and then subsequently Eddie when I was asked to join the modern ward round working group through the college. And we've run a collaborative with Eddie and Lynn and colleagues, and we'll put the resources in the links in the chat, and they're also on the slides there. There are some really good examples within the document around patient involvement. A couple of things I've just pulled out there. So both Norfolk Community Health Trust and the wardround.net, which is based in Sweden, Valdemar recently presented with, looked at patient confidentiality and the importance of taking the patient away from the ward environment with the team to have confidential conversations. I used to, when I was a young doctor, used to smile when my boss used to say, well, we're going to pull the curtains around the patient so all the other patients in the bay can listen to the bad news that I'm about to break, you know, which is kind of the biggest irony, isn't it? But some really good examples of the power that they did that and the impact that had on patients. Emerson Green looked at is a private care provider, but looked at patient involvement questions around elective surgery. So it's not just around an acute ward. George Elliott did some really nice work with shared decision making on ward rounds about improving that communication. And we had a very good presentation from the team at Yeovil talking about the work they did on reducing noise on the wards. And wards are inherently noisy, and they've put a simple thing in about measuring the decibels on the ward and having, as Eddie would point out, a red line, a threshold over which they didn't step in terms of decibels. And it really changed the culture in the ward and the healing environment. So that's really good examples there. I think my colleague Amit has just joined. I think I saw him in the virtual lobby. Amit, are you there?
I am, thank you. And sorry, I was late with the internet connection problems as well.
Amit, thank you so much. I was just singing your praises earlier, so it's lovely to see you in person. You were instrumental in supporting the Winter Games in the east of England. What were the highlights for you, and how, you know, the approach and things? How did it go from your perspective?
So I think the important thing was that from a support point of view, that we in the ECIST team and the East of England regional team provided was to give some support and give some ideas, and the credit of all the successes of 178 teams across the East of England who developed their own work, their own projects, depending on what their need was, what they thought might be useful for their patients, their staff, what they might be able to deliver. That's what they delivered. It was their own journey. It was their own making of whatever they wanted to make. So, and in return, I think the inspiration that they gave to all the other teams in other areas, the motivation that they provided to the staff of doing a good job, the benefits to the patients were absolutely remarkable. Now, I think the important thing there is it also gives all of us a lot of food for thought as to what a single ward can do without having additional 20 nurses and 30 doctors and 40 carers and 50 cleaners, because they are not going to come tomorrow. It's down to really all of us as to how they can make the stay in the hospitals beneficial to patients. And that's what they demonstrated. And based on that success of people's ideas and implementation of those brilliant ideas, the decision that we've kind of agreed between various teams is that we will replicate that success across the UK in the next few months, and we are really looking forward to that.
Thanks, Amit. That's great. And I love the fact, the simplicity of it. I think, you know, we often get bogged down in business cases and think the answers are, resource heavy and intensive, and actually none of that was the case, and it was inspiring. I'd also like to bring in, if I may, Helen, who just to declare any conflicts of interest. Helen is my work wife, so bad luck, Helen, on that. So Helen and I, as well as Amit, sort of coordinate things between London and the east of England. Amit and I divide our time, and Helen coordinates and keeps us both in hand. Helen, I know this work, you were heavily involved in this work too, but also supporting the team in terms of rolling this out nationally. Did you want to, you've kindly put your contact details in, did you want to come in and just sort of talk to us about what you and the team are planning and how we're going to support that moving forward over winter?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I suppose just to reiterate what Amit said around deconditioning games, I think it's some of the messages in their simplicity have driven across the region with regards to bringing improvement into all areas and taking the fear out of it with regards to not having to do anything on large scale. The smallest of changes, as you've highlighted, as we've spoken today, make a big difference to patients, and the outcomes are really big. And actually, the patient outcomes for some of the improvements that we saw carers taking out patients and family members from a residential home out to Southend Seafront for the day, because they had toured and they'd exercised and walked enough and created enough steps that's what they'd done on paper, so they wanted to take them out and celebrate their successes. So it's about making it real for patients and making exactly what you've highlighted about making it matter to them. So yeah, absolutely, we need to take it nationally. With the East of England, we've had Amit and myself had some really good ideas and innovative discussions around how we then take this into the next stage for winter, so we can make it everyone's business across. And some of the regions are already wanting to get involved because the East of England have been promoting this already. So Midlands have already started some of the work that they want to do, as have the South West. So I think there's lots of ideas about what's going to be the right thing in each of the individual regions. So it's a bit of a watch this space, but we've got our next innovation hub meeting in a couple of weeks' time, which will then start to put some of those ideas into practice. But currently, there's a bit of a competition going on between Geraldine, who's the regional director of nursing for the East, and Pete Gordon, who is very well known to everyone from an ECIST perspective, about who can be the most shameless and ask for the most recognised celebrity to come and endorse the campaign for reconditioning the nation. So they've got a bit of a task between them. So if anyone's got any celebrity friends up their sleeves, then please let us know, because all socialising of what we're trying to do is really, really helpful.
Thanks, Helen. I did notice Mr. Motivator on a couple of the slides. So
yeah, there's been quite a lot of sports representation. They're trying to outdo each other at the moment. So we'll see who wins.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm aware of the time. I'd like to draw things to a close. Does anyone have any questions that they haven't or would like to raise a hand or put something in the chat box? Just give it a couple of seconds. That's great. Thank you. And Eddie, it has been a huge pleasure. Are there any closing comments, reflections from you that you'd like to add?
Just keep going is my comment, because I think some terrific work has been done already, and there's some great ideas coming forward, and celebrate that success, because obviously life is very tough for all of you, but you are making a difference for the better, and keep going. That's my final comment. Thank you very much, everybody.
Eddie, thank you so much. It's been a huge privilege for us to hear from you today and for you to share your thoughts. We will share the slides and the recording. We will also add in some additional information. We in ECIST are very keen to establish a more collaboration with Eddie and the Patient Care Network, because of the value we think it brings to us as a team, as well as to the teams out in organisations organisations that we work with. We, as part of the collaborative approach, are going to take a break over August, recognising that many staff are on holiday during this time. If you are on going away, I hope you have a very good, nice time and get to recharge the batteries, because things are pretty tricky out there. If you are staying, thank you for holding the fort. You'll be like me, and I'll see you around. Our next events will be in September, so starting the first or second week of September, and we'll be sending emails out and asking people if they'd like to showcase some of the work they've been doing around this, and to celebrate that and give us an opportunity to work together and demonstrate some of the excellent work it's been having. So thank you all very much for your time today. Thank you particularly again to Eddie. Please do leave us some feedback. It's really important to us. Thank you for all that you're doing and all that you continue to do in these very difficult times. And we look forward to seeing you again soon. Good afternoon and take care.
Thank you.